Right now, at this exact moment, while you are watching this video, something is unfolding behind the scenes that is already beginning to affect your daily life in ways most people do not yet fully understand. And by the time it becomes obvious to everyone, the consequences may already be locked in. The cost of living is rising again, but this time it is not gradual, it is not subtle, and it is not being driven by normal economic cycles or seasonal changes that come and go. Your fuel is getting more expensive, your groceries are becoming harder to afford, your heating and electricity bills are quietly climbing higher, and all of it is being driven by a single, massive disruption that has just hit the global system. Nearly 1/5 of the world's oil supply has effectively been cut off, not reduced, not delayed, cut off. That is the scale of what we are talking about, and the country whose actions helped trigger this chain reaction is now turning to its allies with a message that is impossible to ignore and even harder to interpret as cooperation. Send your warships and fix it. Not a request, not a negotiation between equal partners. A demand backed by a warning that has already sent a shockwave through diplomatic circles across Europe, Asia, and beyond. We will remember. Those words came directly from Donald Trump, speaking aboard Air Force One, directed not at rivals, not at adversaries, but at allied nations who chose not to immediately comply with what he was asking. Pause for a moment and really think about what that means in the context of decades of alliances, treaties, and shared military cooperation. A warning issued publicly, aimed at countries that have stood alongside the United States in conflicts, trade agreements, and global strategy for generations. Now, while that message was being delivered from the air with unmistakable clarity, something very different was unfolding on the ground across Europe. Carney was not issuing ultimatums. Then, at the start of the week, he walked through the doors of 10 Downing Street, meeting with Keir Starmer, where the focus was not on pressure but on stability, coordination, and how to prevent a bad situation from becoming something far worse. 3 stops, 3 groups of allies, and at every single one the same message was delivered with consistency and clarity. Canada will stand with its partners, but Canada will not be commanded. And then something happened that very few analysts expected to unfold this quickly or this publicly. One by one, the very allies the United States had called upon began to respond. Not quietly behind closed doors, not through carefully worded statements designed to avoid headlines, but openly, directly, and in a way that left very little room for interpretation. No, not one country stepped forward to comply with the demand. Not one navy was deployed in response. Not one government signaled immediate willingness to follow through. And this is not speculation. This has been confirmed across multiple major international news organizations, including Reuters, the BBC, and the Financial Times. So the question becomes unavoidable. How did we reach a point where multiple major allies would simultaneously refuse a direct request from the United States during a global crisis involving energy supply and strategic waterways? To understand that, you have to go back just a few days earlier, to the moment where everything changed. On February 28, the United States, in coordination with Israel, launched military operations targeting Iran. There was no broad coalition, no NATO briefing, no unified announcement that included allied governments. The decision was made, and the operation was carried out, without the kind of consultation that has traditionally defined coordinated military action among allies. And within days, the response came, and it came fast. Iran moved to shut down one of the most critical choke points in the global energy system, the Strait of Hormuz. If you want to understand the scale of what that means, consider this. Roughly 20% of the world's oil supply passes through that narrow stretch of water every single day under normal conditions. It is one of the most important transit routes on the planet, and suddenly, that flow stopped. Over 1,000 oil tankers were effectively stranded, unable to pass through. Traffic dropped from around 60 vessels per day to zero, not reduced, not slowed, zero. That kind of disruption does not stay contained within shipping lanes. It spreads immediately into global markets. Oil prices surged past $100 per barrel. Energy markets reacted within hours. Shipping costs spiked. Insurance premiums jumped. And the ripple effects began moving outward into every economy connected to global trade, which is to say almost all of them. Now here is where the situation takes a dramatic and controversial turn. Instead of focusing solely on managing the consequences internally or building a coordinated response through existing alliances, the Trump administration turned outward, publicly calling on allies including Japan, France, South Korea, and the United Kingdom to deploy naval forces. The expectation was clear: assist in reopening the strait, help stabilize the situation, share the burden. But when those allies did not immediately respond in the way that was expected, the tone began to shift. What started as a call for cooperation began to sound more like a warning about consequences, implications for NATO, implications for future alliances, implications for how relationships would be remembered moving forward. And that is where something fundamental changed. Because from the perspective of those allied nations, a critical question began to take shape. How do you demand support for a situation that was created without consultation, without shared planning, and without a clear strategy for resolution? And one by one, those countries answered that question in public. Germany responded first, and its message was both direct and difficult to misinterpret. Defense Minister Boris Pistorius addressed the situation with a level of clarity that immediately drew global attention. He questioned what exactly was being expected from European forces. What could a limited number of European naval ships realistically accomplish that the full capabilities of the US Navy could not already achieve? And then came the line that has since been repeated across international media. This is not our war, we did not start it. That was not diplomatic ambiguity. That was a boundary. Japan followed with its own position. No deployment planned. Australia responded just as clearly. No ships will be sent. Italy signaled that expanding the situation further would not be supported. The European Union made its stance unmistakable. There is no appetite for this kind of escalation. And then came the United Kingdom. Standing in London, during the same visit where Carney was meeting with British leadership, Prime Minister Keir Starmer addressed the issue publicly and directly. He made it clear that Britain would not be drawn into a wider conflict. And more importantly, he stated that this situation would not become a NATO mission. That detail carries weight, because NATO is built on collective defense, not unilateral action followed by retroactive expectations. Now here is where the situation becomes even more complicated and, for some, even more concerning. Reports have indicated that even the US Navy has been declining frequent requests from commercial shipping companies to escort vessels through the strait due to the level of risk involved. In other words, the danger is considered too high even for the country leading the call for action. So at the exact same time that allies are being asked, and in some cases pressured, to send their naval forces into the region, the United States itself is not fully committing to that exact role under the same conditions. That contradiction did not go unnoticed, and it significantly influenced how those demands were received by allied governments. Meanwhile, while all of this was unfolding publicly, Canada continued moving in a completely different direction. Instead of issuing demands, it focused on building alignment. Instead of applying pressure, it reinforced partnerships. In Norway, joint military cooperation was strengthened, particularly in Arctic operations where strategic importance continues to grow year after year. In Oslo, discussions with Nordic nations focused on long-term security, intelligence sharing, and coordinated responses to emerging threats. And in London, the emphasis was placed on diplomacy, de-escalation, and maintaining stability in global trade routes without immediately resorting to escalation. And those efforts were noticed. Mette Frederiksen publicly thanked Canada for its leadership. Katrin Jakobsdottir pointed to a growing gap in global leadership and suggested that Canada was actively helping to fill that space. These are not casual remarks. They reflect a broader perception that is forming in real time. One approach relies on pressure, urgency, and expectation. The other relies on presence, coordination, and long-term trust. Now, to be clear, the situation itself remains serious and unresolved. The Strait of Hormuz cannot remain closed indefinitely without causing significant and sustained damage to the global economy. Energy markets depend on it. Supply chains depend on it. And everyday people feel the impact through rising costs almost immediately. But the central issue being debated right now is not whether the strait should be reopened. It is whether a country can act independently, trigger a global consequence, and then demand that its allies step in to resolve the situation under pressure. That is the question being answered right now, in real time, on the global stage. And the answers are not happening quietly. They are being delivered publicly, clearly, and in ways that are being recorded and remembered. Germany's position is now part of the record. Japan's refusal is official. The United Kingdom's stance was delivered on camera. These are not temporary signals. They are markers of a moment that may have longer-term implications. At the same time, something else is happening beneath the surface. Something slower, but potentially more significant. New agreements are being signed. New partnerships are being strengthened. New alignments are beginning to form. Because alliances are not fixed structures. They evolve, they adapt, and sometimes they shift. What this moment reveals is not just a disagreement over a single crisis involving oil, military operations, and a strategic waterway. It reveals a deeper question about how leadership is exercised, how trust is maintained, and how quickly those dynamics can change when pressure replaces coordination. And right now, countries around the world are responding to that difference. The next phase of the story will not just determine how this crisis is resolved. It may determine how alliances function in the years ahead. And the real question is not what has already happened. It is what happens next.